Hello, my name's Peter Moore. Welcome to our Travels Through Time YouTube page. Today we've got a really great conversation for you in video, which I hope you'll enjoy. It's between me and this author, Giles Milton, the author of the book Checkmate in Berlin, which tells a story of the events that happened in Berlin immediately after the end of the Second World War. So we're going to be talking about the year 1945. I hope you enjoy it.
Then, well, I shall begin by saying, Giles Milton, welcome to Travels Through Time. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you today. You've written such a range of fascinating books over the past 25 years, from Nathaniel's Nutmeg, set in the 17th century, to works like Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, and a book that we're going to be talking about today, which I have here. I should hold it up for people who are watching this on video later on. Checkmate Berlin, fabulous book. We'll be talking more about the story in that in a moment. But there's a great breadth there. I want to ask a general question about how do you go about finding your stories?
Well, that's always a tricky one because all of my books really have been based on a lot of primary sources, letters, diaries, unpublished material. That's the stuff I love to deal with that. And it's not always easy to find because a lot of personal, diaries and letters are not stored in archives. You certainly won't find them in the National Archives. So often you have to go in search of, descendants of the people you're writing about, track down the families, and see if they have stuff in, hidden away in boxes in their attics and what have you. And very often you find that that's the case. And they do have, great-grandfather's diary, which no one's looked at for years. And you start investigating and looking into these things, and you discover that they sort of open a window onto another world. And that's what I particularly like is personal stories that rooted in somebody's experience, somebody often quite ordinary, but who found themselves in extraordinary situations, and often at an extraordinary period of history. So through these personal stories, you can sort of open a window onto a chapter of history that people might not know that much about.
I think what you're describing there is something of the excitement of the journalistic quest, which then, kind of is as relevant in history writing as it might be in a feature piece today.
Absolutely. And I mean, even when you go to the National Archives, for example, you absolutely have no idea what you're going to find because the stuff is quite badly catalogued,
Yeah.
So you go along, you order up these files, and these boxes are brought to you. And you really don't know what you're going to find inside. And sometimes you go through, there's absolutely nothing. It's just boring sort of memos from Whitehall or something like that. And then one day you'll open one of these boxes, you'll open up, and it will have just gold dust in it, like nuggets and just fantastic material. And certainly I found that with researching my Berlin book. I found all sorts of stuff I really was not expecting. And suddenly you think, oh, wow, that really changes everything, what's been written about this period. And I've discovered a whole new thing here. And that's tremendously exciting, and I get quite a kick out of that.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. So the National Archives, for those of you listeners who don't know, is just based outside of London, southwest London in Kew, and it's always a bit of a, as you say, it's a bit of a brand tub when you go down there. You're not quite sure what you're going to pull out, and the cataloguing isn't complete. And I've had moments myself where you kind of find yourself reading a letter from the Duke of Wellington that you hadn't expected to find or something. Is there any particular archive in there or any moment of encounter with a bit of archival material that you'd like to share with us, which was just exciting, unexpected, and set you off on a completely different tangent?
I mean, there's so many things that I've sort of unearthed in the archives, and the excitement you get when you pull out a letter and you find it's actually been written by Churchill, or by Stalin even, or by Roosevelt. It's quite extraordinary when you're holding those in your hands. But I mean, one of the things I found when I was researching this book, which really excited me, was. And it's a story that's not at all known. It was a file called Operation Sparkler. And I opened it, I thought, what's all this about? And it was an extraordinary story of basically of one of the greatest crime sprees in history, which was taking place in post-war Berlin, where, it was totally lawless in the city. There was enormous amounts of precious metals, of all sorts of things, penicillin, everything that could be traded on the black market was being traded on the black market. And the British, felt that they ought to get some sort of grip on this. And so they sent out this rather wonderful detective inspector from Scotland Yard to go and sort this out. And this file contained his account of the scale of the criminal activity taking place in Berlin. He just opened a window on, an extraordinary explosion of crime taking place in the city. Many listeners or viewers will have seen The Third Man, all the story in Vienna and the penicillin racket going on. This was happening for real in Berlin, and this was Detective Inspector Tom Hayward's notes on his investigation. It was brilliant.
And it's brilliant in a way because you not only have the period of history that people may or may not be familiar, but you have a point of view, don't you? Because it's written from the perspective of that character. Operation Sparkle is another of those wonderful kind of mission names that seem to crop up in the 1940s. And it all of a sudden feels novelistic and exciting and uncertain, because you can build personality, you can build character around the history.
I think that is important in my books, is that the characters involved in these stories, they're often larger than life, and it's no accident that they find themselves in these situations. They've been chosen because they can do things. They can make things happen. They can change things, And so when you find their personal diaries, etc., especially, well, we'll probably come on to talk about the main character in Checkmate in Berlin. The main character, he didn't pull his punches at all, and he recorded everything in his daily diary, and that daily diary was in the archives of the Army Museum in America. And it's just fascinating because, not only is he setting out what's taking place on the ground day by day, hour by hour in Berlin, but you get his spin on it as well. So which makes it fascinating. Obviously, you have to judge that with care and use other source material as well. But it just, I really felt by the end of the book, I knew this character really well. I knew what he was about. I knew what he was trying to do. And what he was trying to do was something very important.
So just, actually, I really like that. It's a rallying cry for the researcher. And I think that's something we don't get enough of. One last general question before we dive in. Your focus has settled much more on World War II recently, and you've written quite a bit about Churchill, someone who you've mentioned already. I thought it'd be a good opportunity just to ask you, because we're going to talk about Churchill in a specific moment in the story of Checkmate Berlin soon. But I was talking to another historian recently who said there's no historical character whose reputation has undergone such a revolution over the past maybe 20, 30 years as Churchill. And I wanted to just see if I could get something of your opinion on that. What do you make of this revisionist look at Churchill? Is it something that you think was necessary, or are we just in a kind of process of shooting sacred cows at the moment, if that's well put?
It is strange with Churchill. I mean, it's very difficult to judge Churchill from a contemporary point of view in the here and now, because he was of his period. He was he believed in empire. He had these beliefs which nowadays seem rather shocking, but he was a man of his time. And there's another side to Churchill which actually has long fascinated me, and that's his championing of chemical and biological weapons, which is actually not so well known about. But and I wrote about it in, when he was a minister of munitions after the First World War. He was really instrumental in sending British forces into Russia to attack the Red Army, attack the Lenin's Bolsheviks, and he sent them there with vast quantities, 50,000 biological weapons, basically, which were very nasty indeed. But from Churchill's point of view, I mean, he puts quite a robust defense of these weapons. He said, is it really any worse to be, have your head cut off with a saber or something, or be bayoneted in the stomach and to be killed by poison gas or whatever it was, So, but that, he's been highly criticized for that as well. I just think it's something of interest. I think it's ridiculous, really, to judge Churchill then by our standards now.
I think what we're going to do in a moment is see Churchill at a very lively moment, and we can maybe tease out some of these threads a little bit more. So let's get into the history. Checkmate in Berlin. Let's say a few words about the book first, actually, because it's been fabulously well received. It's a thrilling narrative history. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about the book in a kind of broad sense before we dive in close?
Yeah, well, I suppose what sort of set me off on this is the fact that so many books each year are published about the Second World War, and almost nothing is published about the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And this is what really fascinated me, because the world we live in today is essentially the world that was constructed in the sort of 4 or 5 years that followed the end of the Second World War. And so I wanted to look at how sort of the world was going to be reconstructed in the aftermath of the Second World War. Who was going to get what? The sort of divisions of the spoils of war, if you like. That sort of set me off on this, and Germany obviously became the focus of this, because Germany was one of the greatest problems. What the hell do we do with Germany after the end of the Second World War? And also what fascinated me was the gradual sort of falling apart of the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, of course. Now, what attracted me to this story in particular, I think, was that what I'm describing really is a giant geopolitical history, but I didn't want to tell some boring, dry as dust story. And what fascinated me was to focus on the 4 commandants of the 4 sectors of divided Berlin, because their personal relationships and really the fallout between them as gradually, particularly between the Soviet commandant and his Western so-called partners, that fallout, their personal relationships seemed to me to perfectly mirror the geopolitical fallout that was taking place on a much grander scale. So it enabled me to tell this big political story in a very intimate way through the relations and using the letters and diaries of those commandants on the ground.
And it's got an eerie relevance to today, as people will notice as we go through this conversation. Well, let me put to you the question that we put to everyone who comes on the podcast, which is a fun one, hopefully, and it gives you the opportunity for a bit of time traveling. If you could travel back to any calendar year in the past, Giles Milton, which year would you select?
Well, I think it would have to be the year in which my book begins, really, which is 1945, which encompasses, well, it begins really, 1945 begins with the great Yalta conference, where the big 3, you've got Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, meet together in the Crimea to really thrash out a new world order. The war is still taking place at this point, of course. It hasn't been won. But the Allies, the Western Allies and their Soviet partner, they know they are going to win the war, and it's time to plan the peace. Who is going to get what?
Okay, so that's a really good point. I want to just dwell for a moment. The war by that point, you say, was won. Is that a definitive answer? I mean, it's a very we've talked to various historians of the Second World War before, and they've placed their marker in the sand at various different places. D-Day, some people have said 1943 was the real turning point, but really by the start of January 1945, the game was up, wasn't it?
Totally. I mean, yeah, there are many dates you could pick out for where the turning point in the Second World War, but no, I mean, certainly by the time of the Yalta conference, they knew they'd won. The big 3 knew they were going to win. It was simply a matter of time, and really a matter of also making sure that not too many human lives were lost in the process, basically. But yes, they knew they'd won, and they also knew that they were going to be the architects of the post-war world. They were going to decide who got what. So this is an immensely important moment in history, because these 3 all-powerful men, all victors in the war, are going to decide. They're going to divide up the world and decide who gets what. Can
I ask you about this 4th character, who is maybe a little bit more marginal? But I know after D-Day, you have, I don't know what, the liberation of Paris, that's what I wanted to say, which is led by the French, I believe. And de Gaulle is back in control, do they play like, so if we're in the beginning of 1945, are the French, or the new French regime led by de Gaulle, is that does that have any political capital at all, or is it still very much marginalized because of the events of the past 4 years?
That's a really interesting question, and the issue of France was raised and discussed at length at the Yalta conference, because the big three players have decided they're going to divide Germany into two separate parts, East and West. So the Soviets are going to get the East, the Americans and Brits are going to get the West. And then they think, well, what should France get, And they raise this issue, and Stalin says, well, why the hell should the French get anything? They haven't done anything in this war, And eventually, after sort of repeated the persistence of Roosevelt and Churchill, Stalin sort of reluctantly says, oh, well, okay, the French can have a slice of Germany, but it has to come out of your bit. I'm not giving them anything. So it was a real issue at the time. Should the French get anything? And really, actually, it was the Western partners who said yes, they should. And so they will get a chunk of Germany, and they will get a slice of Berlin. And although in Berlin they got the poorest part of North Berlin, a part of the city that had really been reduced to rubble. It was already one of the poorest districts of the city, and so they in some senses they were to play quite a small role in everything that was to happen. However, because they have a sector, because they have a commandant, and because that commandant will have a veto on anything that's decided by the other commandants, it gives them an equal sort of role in the running of the city. So this poor, demolished area of the city, nevertheless, their voice will count equally with the Americans, the British, and the Soviets.
Okay, one last question before we go to the first scene, because Checkmate is a book of maps, I have to say, and I'm a fan of maps. If we're there at the beginning of January 1945, whereabouts were what was the position of the Eastern and the Western Front at that point? Had they crossed the borders into Germany already, or was it like kind of a little bit further off than that?
This is an absolutely critical point, and this really is going to weigh heavily on everything that happens, because by the time of Yalta and shortly afterwards, the Red Army is advancing at dramatic speed. It's taken over huge swathes of territory in Eastern Europe. It's moving through Eastern Germany, Prussia, etc. Whereas the Western armies are still hundreds of miles from Berlin, and I think it was Stalin, either he said publicly or privately, I can't remember. He said basically, people are going to get, the powers are going to get the land that their armies are already controlling, basically. And he's looking at what the Red Army controls and thinks that is going to be my territory at the end of this war. And he's very happy that the Western allies are still a long way from Berlin, because it immensely strengthens his position, the fact that his army is already in most of the territories that he covets.
Okay, let's go to the first scene then. We're going to go to the 4th of February in 1945, and you can tell us whereabouts we'll be, and we'll have a look around, because this is absolutely crucial.
So yes, we're going to now zoom in onto the Crimea. We have Churchill and Roosevelt fly into this airfield, Saki airfield, which incidentally was attacked, bombed very recently.
Is this the same one? Yeah,
it's exactly the same airport. They fly in, Roosevelt and Churchill, and then they're driven on this horrendous 5-hour drive down to Yalta in the south of the Crimea, which is a city in ruins. I mean, this is a sort of Riviera of the Soviet Union at the time. It's a beautiful place, all palm trees and beaches and wonderful 19th century villas, but it's been occupied by the Wehrmacht. They've pretty much trashed the place, and it's been hastily sort of repaired for this meeting of the big three. The big three, of course, are Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin.
Why did they choose Yalta? What was the rationale behind that? Or was it just Stalin's choice and he invited them?
Largely because Stalin refused to travel by air. He was absolutely terrified of flying. And so there were numerous places were suggested to hold this conference, And Stalin said no. He vetoed all of them. He said, "Look, I'll come, but it has to be in Yalta," which he could go to. He could get to by train.
And this was an authentic fear of his. It wasn't a bit of clever politicking, which we associate with him.
No, I think he genuinely was terrified of flying. He flew. I think he'd only flown once before, and that was to the Tehran conference, which had happened, a short while before. And he had been absolutely terrified on that flight. And notably, when there was a final conference in Potsdam some months later, in the summer of 1945, he came by train to that as well. So I think genuinely he was terrified of flying. But this, of course, means that has to fly in, and Roosevelt has to come even further. I mean, he's coming all the way from Washington, stopping off in the Mediterranean on the way. And let's remember, I mean, many listeners and viewers may well know the very famous photo of the three leaders sitting outside one of the great grand villas in Yalta, sitting on their bench, looking rather smug, the victorious partners, But if you look more carefully at that photo, it's quite disturbing, because Roosevelt is a dying man. He will be dead within a couple of months. So he's very, very sick and weak when he flies in to Yalta. And many people said he was really not up being at this incredibly important, conference, international conference to decide the fate of the world. And likewise with Churchill. Churchill was not on form at the Yalta. I mean, all of his aides, there's numerous accounts of one of Alexander Cadogan, one of his most senior aides, said, if only he'd stopped drinking bucketfuls of champagne. He was drinking way, way too much. He was not on form. He was rambling. Roosevelt also was rambling. The one person who was on form, who knew exactly what he wanted and knew exactly how he was going to get it, was Stalin. This was the conference where really he got on paper what he wanted.
We often talk about Churchill as being one of history's great functioning alcoholics, and it seems that he was drinking an extraordinary amount at this point. You write at length in the book about these shipments of wine and champagne and everything which is coming in. I mean, what was going on there? Was he just so excited to have a holiday? Was he full of bravado because the war had turned in the Allies' favor? He was established now as a national hero. Was it some deeper personality defect, or was he playing a game that he thought was going to, did he think that he could get Stalin drunk and elicit from him what he wanted? Do you have some perspective on what was going on behind the drinking?
Yeah, it's very interesting, because there's so much is written about Churchill's drinking, and I was somewhat skeptical about it, I have to say. And it was only when I read all the sort of private accounts by his aides, the people working really closely with him, who said, no, he really was drinking far too much. And perhaps it was stress, it was pressure. This is the end of the war. They're exhausted. He clearly liked to drink as well, So I think it was possibly a mixture of all of those. What is interesting when you mentioned about Stalin, and certainly Stalin, at these lavish banquets that they held at Yalta, because each of the three rulers had their own banquet, at which there was lashings of alcohol was served at these. But it's interesting that Stalin always had a vodka glass in front of him, always had a wine glass in front of him, but very, very rarely drank from them. And in fact, the vodka glass was invariably filled with water. So maybe when he was in the privacy of his own dacha, he drank heavily. But certainly at these crucial meetings, Stalin was wily, he was sober. And, I've been reading a lot about Stalin recently, actually, for a new book I'm researching at the moment. And of course, he was a monster. He was responsible for the death of millions of people. But when he needed to get something, he was highly effective at getting it, and a supremely shrewd political operator.
Comes across very powerfully in the book that he was the one there who was neither unwell nor inebriated, but he went with a very clear set of objectives. I mean, the title of the book is Checkmate in Berlin. There's this idea, people always used to say that the Russians are the best chess players in the world. Well, the Grand Master really was Stalin, wasn't he?
I think so. But I think, as we'll come on to this, but I think he overreached himself in Berlin, actually. I think he misplayed it. He misjudged the Americans. Later in the story, there's the whole Berlin airlift, and when the western sectors have been sealed off by the Soviets. I think in his game of chess, he overplayed his hand, and it's interesting that the commandants on the ground saw themselves as playing a game of chess, a strategic game of chess, and they by 1949 they felt that they were winning on the chessboard.
But if we stick with the chess metaphor for a moment, these are the first moves of the game, really, aren't they? Because I'm not sure how much face-to-face interaction there had been between the three of them before. Obviously, they've been working together intensively over the previous years, but there was a great deal of complexity within those relationships. I mean, even if one of the things we've spoken about on this podcast before is the Katyn massacre, and we know that the British had an awareness of what Stalin had done to the Polish, for example, and so there's a front there, isn't there? There's a lot of theatrical kind of diplomacy which is going on, but beneath which there must have been a hell of a lot of suspicion as well.
I mean, it's really fascinating because for all his political career, Churchill had absolutely detested the Soviet regime. He'd done everything he could to strangle it at birth. I mentioned, landing the British troops in 1918, 1919 to try and kill off the Red Army and Lenin's Bolsheviks, and repeatedly throughout the years that followed, Churchill had sort of lambasted the Soviet regime. He absolutely detested it. But this was a classic case of my enemy's enemy is my friend. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, suddenly Churchill looks around and thinks, we've got to have that guy on our side because that's our surest way to defeat the Nazis. So it was a balance. Basically he had to decide which is the lesser of two evils. Is it Hitler or is it Stalin?
And I think
by the time he gets to, I've just got a little quote in front of me. By the time Churchill gets to Yalta, listen what he's saying at one of his banquets. He says, "It is no exaggeration or compliment of a florid kind when I say that we regard Marshal Stalin's life as most precious to the hopes and hearts of us all. We have a friend in whom we can trust, and I hope he will continue to feel the same about us." This is absolutely extraordinary that Churchill, the man who's detested Stalin for his entire political career, comes to Yalta and heralds him as the great savior of the world. A really dramatic turnaround there.
Absolutely. There's another line from the book where you mentioned Churchill talking to Anthony Eden, and he has some foresight here because he's saying that if there's no kind of accord reached between these different parties, different countries, different personalities, World War III is a possibility. Is that right at that time?
Yeah, and this is good to go back to where we were at the very beginning in the National Archives. There is a folder which I got out and found in the National Archives, and it's simply it's a grey folder, box file, marked Operation Unthinkable. And this is the most extraordinary set of documents I've seen in years, I think, because this was Churchill's plan to attack the Soviet Union in 1945. So he was extremely worried by the enormous power that Stalin and his Red Army were going to have at the end of the war. And he actually asked his chiefs of staff to start planning a massive attack on the Soviet Union carried out by the British and by the Americans. It's called Operation Unthinkable. It really it is unthinkable. And Churchill realized that the Western armies were so much smaller in scale than the Red Army that he thought we'll need more troops to give us any chance of success against Stalin's Red Army. So what does he propose to do? He proposes to bring the Wehrmacht, Hitler's war machine, on the side of the Western Allies. And not only that, he wants to use the SS as part of to spearhead this attack on the Soviet Union. At which point, the chiefs of staff duly plan this for him and give him this dossier, but they do warn him this would be politically unthinkable to do this. The British public simply, and the American public as well, would simply never accept that this wartime ally we've been lauding for the last 4 years, the Soviet Union, we're now going to launch a massive attack and try and destroy it.
That's the most extraordinary archive. Do you know when that dates to? Is this around the time of the Yalta conference, or would it be later?
It's shortly afterwards. It's the late spring of 1945, and all the documents, and they're very, very detailed. I mean, they set out in a very detailed plan exactly the dispositions of the Soviet forces, how many tanks they've got, how many aircraft they've got, correspondingly, how many the Western powers have got. So it really sets out how they're going to try and bring this about and crush the Soviet Union in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War.
Wow. Well, that's it almost feels like another novel for Robert Harris, doesn't it? That story. Maybe
I was listening to only this morning on your podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we'll leave that one, Tim, but it really is an appropriately named document for once. Let me just ask you broadly what happens at Yalta. Take us through when the conference finishes. Pardon me. When the conference finishes, what's been decided?
So each of the big three, they have their sort of wish list, if you want. I suppose Churchill, top of his wish list, I guess, is he wants to preserve the integrity of the British Empire. That's really his thing. That's going to be very difficult in the aftermath of the war. Roosevelt, top of his wish list, well, two things really. He wants the Soviets to join the war against Japan because it's proving enormously costly in American lives. He wants the might of the Red Army to be used against Japan. And he also wants Stalin to sign up to a new body, which is going to be formed, an international body to be known as the United Nations. What does Stalin want? He wants, as I said earlier, he wants to retain all the territories that the Red Army is already in control of. And then the big question, which really hangs over the conference, is what to do with Germany. And this is the big decision. And this is where they really thrash out through days and days of argument, sitting around this big round table with all their advisors, their interpreters, what have you, what to do with Germany. Well, they decide and they agree that Germany will be divided into two separate parts. The Soviets are going to get the east of Germany, and the Western powers, the Americans and the British, and afterwards the French, are going to get West Germany. But then there's a question, the greatest prize of all, if you like, is Berlin, Hitler's capital, now in ruins. Who gets Berlin? Berlin sits fairly and squarely in the middle of Soviet-occupied Germany, but the Western powers want a slice of Berlin. So they decide to do exactly what they're going to do with Germany, they're going to do with Berlin as well. Berlin is going to be split into two. The Soviets will get the east of the city, and the Western powers, the Brits, the Americans, and the French, will get the west of the city. But there is one problem. You talked about your love of maps earlier. You only have to look at a map to see the potential problem, because Berlin, as I said, sits squarely in the Soviet sector of occupied Germany. And the only route into the city for the Western Allies is one autobahn and one railway line. And it doesn't take a genius to look at a map and think, well, hold on a minute. If the Soviets cut the autobahn and cut the railway, then the Western powers would be stuck in Western Berlin and unable to bring in any supplies to their military garrisons and to the people in their sectors of the city. And I'm jumping ahead here, but this is already in 1945. Those on the ground are thinking, we're in a bit of a medieval castle situation here. You know, if they pull up the drawbridges, we're kind of stuck inside. It's going to be like a siege. And of course, this is exactly what's going to play out.
You've got a memorable line in the book, which is Berlin was an island surrounded by Red Sea. And so it becomes. But let's go to Berlin, because that seems to be the city at the very heart of the book. It's the place on everyone's mind at Yalta, because there's a real race to get there first. And we're going to go there on the 2nd of May. 1945. Now, I imagine a lot of people who know World War II chronology well will have some ideas about early May 1945. Hitler would be dead by this point. But what else is happening? What's specific on that day?
So, yeah, just to very quickly set the scene, this massive Soviet army in two giant armies really have advanced into Berlin. They fought their way into the center of Berlin. You're right, Hitler's dead. The old regime has collapsed. Berlin is a city in total ruins. And the Soviets are there, and they are in control of the city. And they alone have won this city. And they want to have some sort of tangible, visible, memorable image to show that they have captured the city. So what happens is this photographer, Soviet photographer called Yevgeny Kaldai, and he wants to produce a very, very striking image that can be flashed around the world to show, look, we took this city, and you, the Western powers, the Americans and Brits, you had no part in it. So he decides that the Reichstag is the most well-known building in the city. He wants to take a picture of a giant red flag, Soviet flag, flying over the Reichstag. But he has a problem. This is on the 1st of May. He looks around for a red flag, and there isn't one. So he flies back to Moscow on one of the numerous flights going backwards and forwards, gets his uncle, who's a tailor, to get a big red tablecloth and sew on a hammer and sickle onto this tablecloth. And then he flies back to Berlin. And on the 2nd of May, he goes to the Reichstag with this giant tablecloth flag, gets a few soldiers, takes them up onto the roof, and hoists the flag, over the Reichstag and takes his picture. Now, some viewers, listeners will be familiar with a very, very famous, iconic picture of the Stars and Stripes being raised over Iwo Jima, which was taken by an American photographer called Joe Rosenthal. If you look at the two photos, that one and the flag over the Reichstag, they are strikingly similar. And this is because Yevgeny Kaldai had seen that photo of the Stars and Stripes being raised over Iwo Jima and said, I'm going to do exactly the same for Berlin. And sure enough, he takes this photo. It's fabulously dramatic. And
we should stress that point, actually. I mean, we'll put one up on the episode page if we can get the copyright. I'm not sure if we'll be able to, but if we can, we'll put one up so you can see this photograph, because it's got that grainy black and white film of the era. But it's the smoke, the ruined buildings, there's the elevation, there's the kind of murky light which we probably associate with Berlin at that time. And the composition, as you say, is just striking, isn't it? You've got the angled flag going across, and the kind of hammer and sickle like kind of falling out beneath. It's quite a thing.
It's quite a thing. And there's one fascinating detail on that photo. On the original photo that Kaldai took, you have soldiers stretching out their arms towards the flagpole. And if you look very, very closely at the original photo, the soldier with his two arms outstretched has got a wristwatch on each arm. And clearly he's looted them from some poor Berliner. And when the Soviet censors saw this, they said to Kaldai, do you think you could just scratch out those wristwatches? Because they're a bit embarrassing, So he scratched out the wristwatches. He made the photo more grainy and darker with smoke billowing in the background. And then this was the finished photo. And as Stalin had intended, this was flashed around the world. And this became really the iconic image of the end of the war, if you like. And it really did exactly what it was intended to do. It showed that the Soviet army, that the Red Army alone, without the help, without the support, without the need of the Americans and British, had taken Hitler's capital.
And this is the founding stone of that great narrative that runs even through to today's society in Russia of the Great Patriotic War, the great victory against the Nazis that we hear Putin talking about so often today. But you've already hinted at something else we've got to talk about here. So we have early May. The Red Army has arrived in Berlin. There's a lot of looting happening, isn't there? And probably we should connect this to maybe Yalta in Crimea, where you said that was a city that was trashed. There's a certain or a very powerful element of revenge that's going on, isn't there, here?
Very much so. So basically the Red Army have come into Berlin, they've captured the city, and the Western Allies are still hundreds of miles from the city. And what happens is that the Red Army basically have 2 months in which to loot, to pillage, and to rape. And they will take full advantage of these 2 months to basically strip Berlin of anything of value that's left in the city. Now, many people will have been to Berlin and will know, it's one of the great cultural capitals of Western Europe, Western civilization. I mean, some of the museums on Museum Island, this vast complex of museums, were stuffed full of, Renaissance masterpieces, statues, Byzantine altarpieces, you name it, it was there in Berlin. And it had been very handily packed up by the Nazis and put into concrete bunkers to stop it getting damaged during the bombardment of the city. What the Soviets now do is simply they pack it up and they cart it back to Moscow. And this is not just a few boxes being taken back. This is tens of thousands of giant crates of all the greatest treasures of Western civilization are packed up and carted back, taken back to Moscow. like the State Museum in Moscow, just one of the museums that received stuff, got 12,500 enormous crates of masterpieces from Berlin. So this was on a huge scale, and the Soviet regime, they even sent in their best museum curators from Moscow to come to Berlin to start sifting through what they really wanted, basically. So you've got this loot going on. At the same time, you've got rape taking place on a hideous scale. The Red Army, the young soldiers who are often drunk with victory, but also drunk on alcohol, they were encouraged by propaganda being churned out by the Red Army to take their revenge on German women. And their own countries had been trashed, their own daughters, mothers had been raped, so they took their revenge. But absolutely terrible time to be a woman in Berlin at the time. And I've read numerous extremely harrowing accounts of what took place. And then the last sort of element of this was the pillage that took place in the Western sectors, because, as I say, the Russians know that the Western allies are going to come into the city within a few weeks. In fact, it's 2 months. So they go into the Western sectors and they strip everything they can find, everything of value, everything that could be of use to the Soviet regime is taken. So many of the big factories, the big industrial plants in Berlin at this time, like Osram, the light bulb manufacturers, these factories still existed. They'd been damaged in the war, but there was still all the heavy plant machinery in these places. That was all unbolted from the floor and carted back to the Soviet Union, back to Moscow. So that when the Allies arrive in their sectors of the city, they find literally there's just nothing left. The place has been completely stripped bare. So it was the Soviets really took great advantage of those 2 months to take whatever they could and take it back to.
It's one of the most affecting sections in the book, I think, because there's almost a manic nature to the looting. The more looting happens, the more people are driven on, and we're driven really into human psychology here. There's many years of war that stands behind this, which leads, I suppose, to this kind of very fervent behaviour. But it's not just the cultural riches that are taken back to the museums, as you say. It's everything. It's like the screws in the machine factories. Everything goes from the big thing to the little thing. And one line I remember from reading the book is that I think at one point you say that the only thing that stopped looted goods being carried back from the west to the east was the fact that some of the train tracks had been kind of levered up, and so they couldn't drive the trains over anymore. So there was, they kind of actually looted the train tracks in some ways. So it was a wholesale stripping.
It is, and actually, there's remarkable similarities between the stories that are coming out of Ukraine of young Russian soldiers now sort of taking away dishwashers and things like that and sending them back home again. This is exactly what was taking place. I mean, all Berliners who still had radios, they had to hand those in. They had to hand in anything that they had of value, and the smaller items were often looted by Russian soldiers. And there are extraordinary stories of young Russian conscripts, taking out taps from people's houses and sending those back home. And they're sending them back to villages in Siberia that don't even have running water. I mean, what they thought they were going to do with these taps, I just don't know. So there's a level of absurdity to it as well.
There absolutely is. Let's just talk very quickly about Hitler, because we're so close. We're on the 2nd, and we know that he died a few days before. Today, the narrative is pretty well established of what happened and his downfall, famously. But at the time, there was no such clarity. I mean, there's a city in ruins, a leader which is this great tyrant who's noticeably absent. A word on this, really, because I think you write about it in the book in a very interesting manner. There's from the beginning, Stalin seizes control of the narrative about what happened to Adolf Hitler, doesn't he?
Yes. So what actually happens is that the Soviets, they discover this jawbone with teeth intact. They managed to contact Hitler's dental nurse, and her account, which is pretty harrowing in itself, is fully set out in my book. But she takes them into the Hitler's bunker, where his dental records are kept, and they managed to compare the jawbone. They've found this charred jawbone, because of course Hitler's corpse has been burnt. They managed to compare this jawbone and the teeth with his dental records, and they know for absolute certainty that Hitler is dead and this is his jawbone. But as you say, Stalin thinks actually it would serve my purpose to keep Hitler alive, because this could be very useful, because I can pretend, or I can say or spill the story that the Western Allies are hiding Hitler. They've captured him and they're keeping him in hiding. And he uses this to sort of devious effect over the coming, the year that follows, really. It's extraordinary, really, that, he is already this wartime alliance, that the war's hardly at an end, and he's already thinking how he can get one up on his so-called Western partners, and that's by inventing a story that Hitler escaped, has been captured by the Western Allies, and they're looking after him, they're keeping him in safety.
What happens to Elena? I'm not going to try and pronounce her surname. It's a bit beyond my
no, it's
ability.
A tragic story. This is the story of the dental nurse.
Yeah, she has a sad story, doesn't she?
It is a sad story, because she's done everything she's asked to do. She takes them to the dental records. They find the dental records. They prove that the teeth belong to Hitler and everything. And then Stalin doesn't want this story to get out, because that's the truth. And so he has her arrested, and she's sent off to like a gulag and spends, years in prison camp for merely telling the truth. It's an awful story.
Or for knowing too much.
It ends up, she does eventually get back to Germany, totally broken by the experience of what's happened.
Let's go to the 1st of July, 1945. There's a change in Berlin, and you're going to tell us what happens on that day.
So at long last, 2 months after the Soviets have arrived in the city, the Western Allies arrive. And at their head is the protagonist and the hero, if you like, of my book, which is the American commandant, the man who's to become the American commandant and commandant of the American sector of Berlin, I should say, Colonel Frank Howling Mad Howley. And he is just a fabulous character. He's a real, true sort of all-American cowboy, basically, that the Americans are going to send into the city to run their sector. Howley is a highly experienced individual. He's a brilliant with logistics. He's brilliant at bringing order to chaos, if you like. He's the one that managed to keep Paris fed in the immediate aftermath of the liberation. He's a guy that doesn't believe in any rules unless they're his own. He doesn't believe in red tape unless it's a red tape that he's put in place, basically. He is a doer. He gets things done, and he swings into town like this, as I say, this all-American cowboy, determined to take over his sectors of the city, and he goes there in good faith. He thinks that, well, the Germans are the enemy still, and the Russians are our wartime allies. But within hours of reaching the city, in fact, even when he's en route to the city, crossing that sea of red, which we mentioned earlier, into the western sectors of the city, he suddenly begins to dawn on him that perhaps these allies aren't allies any longer. And perhaps the enemy Germans aren't enemies any longer. And perhaps the world has undergone a profound shift in just a few short weeks. And perhaps we're now allied with the wrong side, and we should be actually working with the Germans and against the Soviets. And this is this great realization that actually the world has shifted. And Howley is thinking this long in advance of anything that's taking place in Washington or in Whitehall. He's on the ground, and he sees that these guys, these wartime allies, the Russians, the Soviets, the Red Army, they cannot be trusted. And so from day one, when he's in Berlin, we begin to see the world has shifted, and there is the beginnings already of a fissure, if you like, of a conflict between the Western powers and the Soviets.
If we were to be sat in the back of Howley's Jeep on the 1st of July, watching him, like what kind of character is he? I mean, you've talked about when you spend time with these characters and in the research, and you get to kind of have a real sense of what they're like and what they're going to do, what's going on in their mind. Could you talk about like kind of him as a decision maker on the ground, where you have to often make very tight judgment calls in a very short space of time, and things aren't always what they seem, especially with the Russians playing these quite advanced psychological games and often doing the opposite to what they're professing that they're doing. How did Howley operate? So, yeah, if you just talk about him in a way that animates him for the listener, please.
First of all, you mentioned a jeep. Howley would not travel in a jeep. Howley rode into Berlin at the head of an amazing armored convoy. He himself was traveling the front car, which was a Horch Roadster, which is sort of the Rolls Royce of Nazi Germany, if you like, with the stars and stripes flying from the fenders. He had all the chrome polished. He was a showman, and this was his greatest theatrical moment. So he arrives in Berlin. At the head behind him are hundreds and hundreds of tanks. He's had them all repainted. They've all got the stars and stripes flying, everywhere. It's a masterful piece of pageantry, and this is sort of Howley all over. He was a showman, and this is a great triumph for him. Now, how's he going to deal with the Soviets? So there are two important things I think to say. Is that each commandant would run their own sector. So Colonel Howley will run the American sector. There'll be a British brigadier running the British sector. But also they realize that Berlin as a whole, the city as a whole, has to have some sort of body in which they can discuss issues that affect the city as a whole, like rationing, for example, would be one of these. And this is where the four commandants will meet on a weekly basis in this building called the Kommandatura in Berlin. And this is where Howley, it's wonderful because Howley really shows his true colors here, where he constantly is on the attack against his Soviet counterpart, General Alexander Kotikov. And he is adamant that he's going to win this battle. He's not going to allow the Soviets to ever get the upper hand. And so you have this sort of titanic clash of wills particularly between Colonel Howley and his Soviet opposite number. And what's rather extraordinary about what took place in the Kommandatura, two things really. When I was in Berlin and I went to the building, and the front door was open, and I sort of pushed my way in, and eventually someone said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I would explain what I was doing." And I said I wanted to see the first floor where Colonel Howley met with his other commandants, and the chap took me up there, and the room was absolutely unchanged since 1945. Nothing. I've got photos of it. It had the same table, the same chairs, the same chandeliers. Everything was the same. So I felt I'd walked into this sort of time machine, if you like. And the other thing to say is that every single word ever spoken in that room, every insult, every barbed jibe from Colonel Howley, everything was recorded because there was a team of stenographers writing down every single word. So I had this fascinating snapshot of time, if you like, between 45 and 49, where I could almost reconstruct exactly what was taking place, exactly how these relationships were steadily breaking down, how Howley realizes that the Soviets can no longer be trusted, that they're a bunch of gangsters, basically. And he says, when you're dealing with gangsters, you treat them like gangsters. And all his arguments, his ferocious rows that took place in the Kommandatura, we have an exact record of them. And for writing a book like this was absolutely priceless material.
So did you find him in a way, what was your judgment of Howley in the end? Did you find him an inspiring character? Was he a reassuring character? Was he the kind of person that you trusted when he was in the room, that he brought a sense of order over things? Or was he more of the maverick that you point out? There's a nice line in the book where you say he had a knack of just doing everything a little bit better than everybody else, which I think is a nice description. But
I think the important thing about Howley, first of all, was he was effective. He got things done. He'd run the port of Cherbourg, which was in ruins shortly after D-Day. As I said, he'd fed 5 million starving Parisians, kept them alive. So he did get things done. And I think what he did also, which was extremely important, was that he said to Berliners, and this is as we move on through the years that follow, he said to the Berliners, we as Americans, and I, as Colonel Howley, the American commandant, will never abandon this city, because the Soviets are trying to take control of the city. They want control of the whole of Berlin. They want to kick the Americans and British and French out of the city. And Colonel Howley, in this incredibly bullish, upbeat press conferences that he gave in front of the world's media. Remember, the world is focused on Berlin. The world is looking at what is taking place in Berlin. And you have Colonel Howley standing up in front of the world's media saying, we will never abandon this city. And Berliners believed him. And by him saying this, he managed to keep the morale of Berliners up during this extraordinarily tense and difficult period. So I think he played a major role, really is a major figure in the early Cold War.
So it's fascinating. Well, I think what we've got here is all the pieces on the chessboard very nicely arranged for what happens next. Howley does, we'll talk a tiny bit about the long arc of history here, but we'll leave most of it for the book. Howley plays a very big role over the next few years, doesn't he?
He does, because Howley has realized what Washington and Whitehall have not yet realized or not accepted, is that the Soviets are indeed the enemy. And really what Howley does through his actions on the ground, but also working behind the scenes, is he tries to persuade the new president, President Truman, and the new prime minister in Britain as well, and particularly Ernest Bevin, the new very important foreign secretary, that the Soviets can no longer be trusted, and that essentially that we should just flip everything, and that make the Germans should become our ally once again, and we should accept that the Soviets are the enemy. So basically, through Howley's actions, we see a total reversal of foreign policy. Geopolitics changes dramatically in 1946, really, where you have the Truman Doctrine, you have the Marshall Plan comes into being, which at its heart is saying we're going to rebuild Germany, Western Germany, we're going to rebuild as an allied partner. And we're going to accept that Stalin and the Soviet Union are now the enemy. The wartime alliance is over, and there are plenty of reasons why this comes about. But Howley on the ground is really instrumental in overseeing this dramatic shift, which basically shaped the world, the post-war world. The world we still live in now was shaped in this period between 1945 and 1949.
He's a fantastic character. The book's a great achievement. There's so much in there that people will read and nod along with at the same time, because, as you say, it really does capture a lot of what's going on with us today. We'll leave the history suspended there, but I'm going to put one last question to you before we finish, which is our little bit of material history. If you could bring an object back from 1945, maybe something from the journey that we've been along today, what would you like?
Well, I've sort of got one eye on the looting that was taking place in 1945, and I think since everyone else is looting, I think I might take a bit of loot myself. I guess one thing that I would rather like, sort of in a nice cabinet in my house, would be the Schliemann gold. This is the famous gold from Troy. Wonderful treasure. People might remember there's a picture of Schliemann who found it, his wife dressed up as Helen of Troy, wearing all this gorgeous jewelry. Well, I think my wife would rather like that jewelry. So if I'm allowed one thing, I'll take that, which incidentally, that treasure, which was looted in 1945, has never been returned to Berlin. Some of the loot was returned in the period when Yeltsin was in charge of the crumbling Soviet Union. There was a sort of an accord struck with Germany, and some of the treasure was sent back, but the Schliemann gold remains somewhere in Russia today. But if I got my way, it would be in my house, in a nice cabinet in the living room, with my wife swanning around with Helen of Troy's treasure in her hair.
Well, that's quite a thought, quite a picture. I imagine you get lots of visitors as well.
Yes, exactly.
If that was the case, I'm gonna, for those of you,
the insurance might cost me a bit though.
Yeah, you might have to have a special box for that one. Okay, so here's a book for those of you watching on YouTube. It's Checkmate in Berlin, Giles Milton. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Thank you very much for coming on Travels Through Time.
Thank you very much for having me on.
That was me, Peter Moore, talking to Giles Milton about the events that happen in this book. Checkmate in Berlin is out in paperback right now. It's full of characters you'll probably heard about and events that you probably know, but ones which really seem to resound today in our times as well. Thanks very much for listening. Please do subscribe to our feed to get the first news of new episodes. Till next time, thank you. Bye-bye.